Hi, everyone. This is S.J. Thomason with Christian-Apologist.com, which is a part of Psalm 23 Apologetics. And today I'm going to talk a bit about some of the prophecies in the Old Testament that pointed to Jesus in the New Testament. And so we're going to specifically focus on Psalm 22 and Isaiah 7, Isaiah 7:14 to be more specific, and Isaiah 53, and more specifically 53:9 and 53:11. And so we're going to talk about that. We're also going to talk a little bit about Psalm 110, because we talked about Psalm 110 before. I want to say welcome to everybody in the chat. I see some old friends and some new friends, and some people who probably don't consider themselves friends, but it's fine if you're here to voice your opinions. I encourage that. I don't mind being challenged. And so if I'm putting out something that is getting under your skin, it's fine to come in here and share your thoughts on that. And so what I'm going to first do is focus on a couple of experts. I've got Dr. James White and Dr. Michael Brown here to voice their opinions on Psalm 22. And so, as you know, if you know Dr. Michael Brown, he is a messianic Jew, and he was raised as a Jew for Judaism. He was raised as a Jewish person who came to Christianity in his late teens after battling drugs and all sorts of other things. And since then, he's debated a whole bunch of rabbis, and he has developed very well thoughtful, understood perspectives of the Old Testament and the New Testament, of course, but the Old Testament referring to the Jewish Tanakh. So here we go.
The very first days that I started talking with rabbis, this would be one of the things that would come up, that I would be told that Psalm 22 is mistranslated. They pierced my hands and feet is not what the Hebrew says. So immediately you take out your King James Bible, which was the Bible, the only Bible for me as a new believer, and take it out and you look, and even though it's not quoted in the New Testament, that part of the verse, other parts of Psalm 22 are clearly quoted in the New Testament with reference to the crucifixion. But that particular verse is not, it pierced my hands and feet. There it is. I'm looking at it in King James, and it says that. And they're showing me in the Hebrew Bible, look, that's not what the Hebrew says. And just read the Hebrew yourself. You can see it doesn't say they pierced. So the Christians changed it.
Right.
So aside from the larger question of, is Psalm 22 a prophecy? Is it a messianic prophecy? How does it apply to Jesus? There's the specific challenge that we get, that Christian translators changed the Hebrew to make it look like the crucifixion. This is how dishonest the Christian translators are.
It is a regular part of, I guess, what you would sometimes call the anti-missionary movement, or whatever terminology you might want to utilize. And certainly that particular aspect I want to get to, but I think it would be very helpful if, before we get to that particular subject, and whether that has anything to do with Christian translators or anything along those lines, we don't live in a day where, well, I've often said, I think many people in the church today are canonically challenged. That is, they have 22 books that are fully canonical and 39 books that are really good for coming up with stories. And flannel graph and things like that, but not necessarily on the same level. And we can't assume that everyone has a really good, solid grasp of what the Tanakh says and what the Psalter says. You know, at my church, we preach through the Psalter on Wednesday evenings. And
so I'm going to go into a couple of slides just to share with you so that you can get an idea of where we're coming from on this whole thing. And so let me go ahead and do that. So I'm going to show you some information. I'm going to go back and we're going to look at the Masoretic texts. We're going to look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we're, of course, going to also take a look at the Septuagint, or Septuagint, depending on how you want to pronounce that. And so here we go. Okay, so hopefully you can see this. So again, we're talking about biblical translations of Psalms 22:16, 110:1, and Isaiah 7:14 and 53. So in the Septuagint, we see it's Koine Greek became the lingua franca, or the common language in the ancient Near East, following Alexander the Great's conquering of the region, somewhere around 332. There was a time when this all occurred. And at the request of Ptolemy II of Philadelphus, between 285 and 247 BC, or right around those dates, 70 scholars, or later what was 72, translated the Hebrew Torah into Greek. The other Old Testament books were translated soon afterwards, although we have rather murky evidence on specifically when the other books were translated. I could not find specific dates. I saw a lot of assertions by different people thinking about when that was. And so this was also revealed by a letter of Aristeas. So this was something that we see that occurred. So he was referring to how Ptolemy came about and summoned these 70 scholars. And this letter has been sort of discounted a little bit because I would say it's a little bit of propaganda in some ways. And they discovered a couple of things about it that were incorrect historically. So the quality of portions of the Septuagint vary as the translators vary, with the Torah being of highest quality. So that is something that I have heard. The quality did vary because, again, you have different translators involved. And so I will say Septuagint. I've actually also even heard Septuagint. So I'll just say, I'll go with what Kip Davis wants me to say. I also want to say hi to all of you in the audience. Kip, Evidence and Reasons, Hellbound Heathen, JB, Jim Majors, Digital Gnosis. So I've got a few people in here. So the New Testament authors frequently reference the Septuagint, and the Greek Orthodox Church has also favored the Septuagint. Then there's the Masoretic text. So the Masoretic texts are Hebrew translations of the Tanakh, which contains the Torah, writings, and prophets. And these were put down. There's a number of them, and they were put down between the 6th and the 10th centuries AD. Okay, so hundreds of years after Christ walked the earth, these texts were compiled. And the King James Version of the Bible relied quite a bit on Masoretic translations in the Old Testament, although we do see evidence it also is using other translations and ancient material. And most Western Protestant churches and the Roman Catholic Church have tended to favor the Masoretic translations. Other versions, such as the ESV and the NASB, they tend to rely on a combination of Masoretic, Septuagint, and Dead Sea texts. So you want to ensure that we look at all of those. You want to make sure you get the original authorial intent. Oh, I see that you guys can't see my screen that I'm sharing. Okay, let me just get back to. Okay, so sorry about that. I meant to show you this. So here we go. Okay, so hopefully you can see that. So we want to reconcile differences between the two. And I think one of the ways that we can come up with the most correct information about all of these ancient texts is to make sure we try to find what the original authors thought. And so going back further can be pretty helpful in doing that. So what is this? I see I've got some other people in here. It's like, okay, so when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered around 1948, it became easier to determine the original intent of the Hebrew language, since most believe they were written between the 3rd century and the 1st century BC. Also note that the Masoretic text added in some vowels to be able to pronounce some of the words in that text more clearly. So the first thing we're going to talk about right now is Isaiah 7:14. I can see now it's not changing. What is going on here? Okay, so let me just try this again to share this, because I'm just noticing this is not showing you the screens as I'm going. Oh, you can see it now. Okay. Okay, so Isaiah 7:14, according to the ESV, it says, "Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel." Now the Jewish version says, "Therefore the Lord of his own shall give you a sign. Behold, the young woman is with child, and she shall bear a son, and she shall call his name Emmanuel." Now the KJV says, "Therefore the Lord himself shall give you a sign. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel." Now think about this. We've got the Syriac, Peshitta, in 2nd century uses a word that translates as chaste girl or virgin. The Vulgate translates, Jerome argued the Hebrew word should be read as Virgo, and it meant abscondia, dita, or hidden or cloistered girl, which would necessitate a virgin. We also know that the Greek Septuagint translates the word Parthenos, which is a constellation, which can be translated as Virgo or young girl. Okay, so they use that word. So you have either or. And then Matthew 1:23 repeats that. So Matthew draws our attention to the original verse. And he says, behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel. Now, what you want to notice there is Matthew drawing our attention to that. And this is supposedly going to be a sign. I don't believe it would be a sign if a young woman simply gave birth naturally. What makes that so special? So this is a consideration. Now, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have the word for Alma, which appears to have meant virgin during the ancient times and young unmarried woman who may or may not be a virgin. But the assumption would be in the ancient culture that a young unmarried woman in this Jewish culture that highly exalted virginity, that this young woman would be a virgin. And that is what would make very special. So the NRSV, which I think is one of the most rotten translations of Isaiah, that one says, therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Look, the young woman is with child and shall bear a son and shall name him Emmanuel. So that is the conclusion. So the conclusion is, if I want to sum this up, is if we go back to the ancients, to what the Septuagint said, basically in the earliest writings. Now, the Septuagint was believed to have been written right around 250 BC. And so somewhere between that, but before Christ, somewhere between that and the first 100 years before Christ. So somewhere around that 2nd century, 3rd century BC, somewhere in that area. And in the Septuagint, again, they referenced a word that was Parthenos, that could go back and be either the virgin or the young woman, a young unmarried woman. And so other translations have come into there to state that it should probably be the young unmarried woman would be a virgin, because that'd be the assumption in the ancient times. And that would be a sign. That would certainly be a sign. So in Psalm 22, now this is the ESV, that tends to be one of my favorite translations, although I do recommend using other ones and referring to a variety of them just to try to get what the gist is of many passages. So we see these verses that say, Psalm 22, 1-18, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me? From the words of my groaning, oh my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but I find no rest. Yet you are holy, enthroned on the praises of Israel. In you our fathers trusted. They trusted and you delivered them. To you they cried and were rescued. In you they trusted and were not put to shame. But I am a worm and not a man, scorned by mankind and despised by the people. Now you can notice the direct reference here of despised by the people. This goes back to Isaiah 52 and the latter parts of 52 and 53. We saw the suffering servant who came about. He had been despised by the people. They didn't understand who he was. Just like King David said in Psalm 118, the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. And just like Isaiah noted numerous times, the Gentiles would come to believe. All who see me mock me. They make mouths at me. They wag their heads. He trusts in the Lord. Let him deliver him. Let him rescue him, for he delights in him. Yet you are he who took me from the womb. You made me trust you at my mother's breast. On you I was cast from my birth, and from my mother's womb you have been my God. Be not far from me, for trouble is near, and there is none to help. Many bulls encompass me. Strong bulls of Bashan surround me. Now Bashan, the reference of bulls of Bashan, this is a reference sort of on a demonic activity, demons, that sort of thing. If you listen to Michael Heiser on that, you'll find some fascinating stuff about the demonic activities associated with Bashan is a region. And the other things that you're going to notice is this is a direct reference to the people who were surrounding Jesus during the crucifixion. Now think about this. These bulls are encompassing him. These are people, references to animals, wild animals in a way, who are surrounding him, which is the Pharisees. They were mocking him. They open wide their mouths at me like a ravening and roaring lion. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It is melted within my breast. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to my jaws. You lay in me the dust of death. For dogs encompass me, a company of evildoers encircles me. They have pierced my hands and my feet. I can count all my bones. They stare and gloat over me. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. So the lines that we're discussing very specifically here is Psalm 22:17. They have pierced my hands and my feet. So we need to know exactly what that is. What are we talking about here? And so here's the letters in question. So if we go back to the Septuagint, which again, you can see here with the Roman numerals for 70, referring to the 70 original translators, you see the Greek word krujon that was translated back then is they have pierced. That is what they took that word to mean in the Septuagint. Now, in the Hebrew, the word means pierced or dug. Now, the word, as Dr. Michael Brown has pointed out numerous times, he looks at the idea of ka'ari versus ka'aru. Now, ka'ari is what you see right there on the right at the bottom. Ka'aru is what you see on the left at the bottom. Okay, and ka'aru is the word that would say that we were pierced or dug a hole, bore a hole, something like that. And ka'ari refers to a lion. Now think about how this would read the verse. Like a lion, my hands and feet. It doesn't even make any sense. So the other idea that the ancient Jews translated into Greek was pierced my hands and feet. Now that does make sense. Or bore a hole, dug a hole, that sort of a thing. So you can see how could we solve whether or not and how this all came about. So some people have argued that the Masoretes changed this later. Okay, they changed this. So we can go back, if we go to the Dead Sea Scrolls, we can consult this original verse. Thankfully, this has been preserved. Psalm 22 was discovered in the Nahal Haver. Okay, and so that was discovered. And here's from an author who has written an academic article on this, and it says the discovery of the text of Psalm 22:16 at Nahal Haver strikes at the heart of controversy. This important text adds strong support to the Septuagint's translation, which has stood in conflict with the Masoretic text for so long. The new evidence from the Dead Sea wilderness shows that the Hebrew rendering of the word was not a late change introduced into the manuscripts of the Psalms to support the Christian theology, but rather it existed before the Jewish-Christian controversy began. And so you can see it right here. You can see the letter if you open it up on the left, because Jewish reads from right to left. So on the far left, you can see the letter, which is consistent with the ending on the left, okay, which would mean it says, they have pierced my hands and feet. Okay, and again, there's another video with Drs. Brown and White right here that I've referenced where they also make this very specific. And so we can also, again, this particular study comes from Hopkins and BYU Studies Quarterly. It says, one of the Dead Sea Scrolls fragments contains Psalm 22:16. This fragment, published in 1997, was discovered in a cache of scrolls at Nahal Haver in Israel during the 1950s. Significantly, this fragment contains the crucial word in the form of a third-person plural verb, written V-R-A-K. Of course, those are the English letters translation of the Hebrew word. While it can often be difficult to distinguish between a wa and a yod, in the Dead Sea text, the editors of the most authoritative edition of the scrolls, Discoveries in the Judean Desert, confirm this reading in its transliteration. In other words, people with no axe to grind have looked at this and they realize that when they analyze this, they actually see that it's going to be the word pierced. So think about this. When this was written in the Psalms around 1,000 years before Christ walked the earth, they hadn't even invented the crucifixion as a means of persecution. That wasn't invented until around the 4th century BC by the Persians. And so the fact that it referred to pierced my hands and feet, and also referred to things such as, bones out of joint, all of these sorts of things, people surrounding him, he's unable to move, people are encircling him, they're making fun of him, they're taking his clothing. They cast lots, of course, the crucifixion as a means of persecution where they would take people's clothes off. It was very humiliating. They would make you naked. What else would this describe besides a crucifixion? I would like to hear people if they have other suggestions of what that could describe. And so, unfortunately, we have terrible translations, again, coming from places like the NRSV. And so in the NRSV, it says, dogs are all around me, a company of evildoers encircles me, my hands and feet have shriveled. Now, Vall in 1997 in the Journal of Biblical Literature pointed this out as a huge inadequacy. It's a terrible translation. It's a people desperate to try to eliminate the prophecy from Psalm 22, just create these ridiculous translations. Now, let's cross-reference some important things to do. You want to cross-reference you want to cross-reference Zechariah 12:10 and Isaiah 53 as well. So you'll see in Zechariah 12:10 it says, "And I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and pleas for mercy, so that when they look on me, on him whom they have pierced, they shall mourn for him, as one mourns for an only child, and weep bitterly over him as one weeps over a firstborn." Okay, so going to Zechariah 12:10, that again was written hundreds of years before Jesus walked the earth. Same with Isaiah 53:5, "But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed." Okay, so then we go to Psalm 110, and I'm going to get back to Isaiah 53 in a minute because I have more on that in just a second. So in Psalm 110:1, in the English Standard Version of the Bible, the Lord Yahweh says to my Lord Adonai, "Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool." Now, when this was translated in the Septuagint, the Kyrios is the word that's used in those instances, which is either a deity or a non-deity. Now, one of the things that occurred when the Masoretes came about is they decided to add vowels, and they wanted to distinguish Adonai, AI at the end, from Adoni, which they said would only be a non-deity master or superior. So various translations use the all lowercase Lord to remove divine status and imply master. But of course, think about this. Who would be David's master? David was ordained by God as a king. Who is his master that's earthly if this is just a non-deity Lord? Okay. Actually, the master had to be above him. So it only makes sense that it's a reference to the Messiah. Now, Jesus stumped the Pharisees who realized, one, the Messiah would be a son of David, and two, a father couldn't elevate a son with a master title as per the 10 Commandments. So he stumped them. They didn't know how to answer him when he referred to Psalm 110. And so they said they didn't know. And one of the reasons they didn't know, again, because they realized, number one, David was supposed to be, the Messiah is supposed to be the son of David. David had no earthly superiors. This is clearly a reference to the Messiah. Now, I've done another video that looked into the authorship of this particular verse, and that's also in my recent videos that I put out. So if you guys want to get more specific on this one. But you can see, look at all these cross-references. Psalm 110 is the most cross-referenced psalm or passage in the New Testament, from the Old Testament into the New Testament. So look at all of these different cross-references. Matthew 22:24, 26:64, Mark 12:36, 14:62, and 16:19, Luke 20:42 and 22:69, Acts 2:34, 1 Corinthians 15:25, Ephesians 1:20 and 22, Colossians 3:1, Hebrews 1:3 and 8:1, and 10:12-13 and 12:2. So we've got numerous places where you can find Psalm 110 cross-references. It's because the Lord said to my Lord clearly establishes two powers in heaven. Okay, if you want to read up on how some Jewish people did believe there are two powers in heaven, you can look at Alan Siegel's work on that. Okay, so we can go to Alan Siegel if you need more information on that. Now, the other important thing that is in the passage of Psalm 110 is the reference to the right hand, the mighty right hand of God. Now, look at these passages that also reference the right hand, and we can see how important this is. So Isaiah 62:8 says, "The Lord has sworn by his right hand and by his mighty arm." Cross-reference that with Hebrews 6:13. "For when God made a promise to Abraham, since he had no one greater by whom to swear, he swore by himself." Exodus 15:6 says, "Your right hand, O Lord, glorious in power. Your right hand, O Lord, shatters the enemy." Psalm 18:35, "You have given me the shield of your salvation, and your right hand supported me, and your gentleness made me great." Psalm 48:10, "As your name, O God, so your praise reaches to the ends of the earth. Your right hand is filled with righteousness." You see, these are direct references to the importance of sitting at the right hand. The right hand is the righteousness. Jesus is at the right hand. Jesus is righteous. Psalm 63:8, "My soul clings to you. Your right hand upholds me." And then 139, 9-10, "If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me." Okay, you can see how there's many references to the right hand. Now, again, going back to some other things, Mark 12:35, just to get specifics on the ones that I mentioned. The Lord, Kyrios, said to my Lord, Kyrios, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet. And then Luke 20:42, for David himself says in the Psalms, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand. So all of the translations from the Greek come in with the word Kyrios, which can mean a Lord that's divine or a Lord that's not divine, but it never specifies that it's only non-divine, which is what the Masoretes did. Okay, so the Masoretes took a word, added some vowels, and then said that that particular Lord is not divine. That's a new thing. Like I mentioned before, the Masoretic text didn't even come out until hundreds of years after the New Testament. So who is David's Lord and Master? Again, you can look at that entire verse and just notice that the Dead Sea Scrolls, when we get back to that, that does not distinguish these new vowels that were added by the Masoretes. Okay. So we have the Adonai. In our translations, it's Y-N-D-A. And so this is from another article that I found. It says, in the Second Temple period, Adonai frequently is substituted for YHWH, the tetragrammaton, because ancient Jews decided the name was too sacred to speak. The alteration of Adonai for Yahweh is present in a number of Dead Sea Scrolls. The ending AI is either my Lord's or Lord par excellence, and that's from Al-Hadif Lake in 2014. Okay, so despite findings, again, going back to the crappiest Bible translation, I can't say that. There are some other pretty strong contenders for the worst Bible translation out there. There's one called The Message, which is downright absurd. It's some guy's musings, pretty much. But this one, the NRSV is one that Bart Ehrman endorses, and he was also serving on the board when they were creating the NRSV in the 80s. And so I would say anything that this agnostic Bart Ehrman endorses is dubious. So I went back and I took a look at a bunch of verses in the NRSV, and I found stuff like this. The Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. You'll notice the Lord, second one, is not capitalized, which is the way the NRSV authors are trying to express the intent of a non-deity Lord. Now, so there's other New Testament references in the Septuagint. So how would I know? I'm looking at the chat. It's hard to go back and forth with my slides. I'm almost done with my slides, which I'll come over to the chat. But I have Kip Davis, and he is working on videos and stuff, it looks like, with Psalm 110. How do I know if a translation is good or poor? Well, what I would do, Kip, is I would try to go back to the original authorial intent. You can, Slam Susan, you can leave his stuff there if he wants to get in there. That's okay if he wants to express his views. I think he is, from what somebody's saying here, is that I think he might be a scholar himself. And so I definitely feel that some scholars have crept into the halls of the New Testament studies who happen to be agnostic and do have chips to grind. And we see that in one of these translations, which I'm going to show you in a bit. So in the Septuagint of Isaiah 53:9, okay, and this is from Brenton's translation that I found in Bible Hub. It says, I will give the wicked for his burial and the rich for his death, for he practiced no iniquity nor craft in his mouth. Okay, you can compare that with 1 Peter 2:22. He committed no sin, neither was he deceit found in his mouth. Now, these are two references that relate to each other. You can see in a lot of cases, the New Testament authors reference the Septuagint. Okay, they went right back to the Septuagint and quoted it quite frequently in the New Testament. That speaks to the value of the Septuagint, which is used, again, like I mentioned, in the Greek Orthodox Church. The Septuagint was the one that was read at the time by people who were Jewish. So all of the apostles were familiar with the Septuagint. And so they quoted from it. Now, in the Septuagint, again, it uses the word no iniquity, no sin. He did not sin. Okay, now the English translations, many of them replace that with he had done no violence or he had committed no violence. And they don't say no sin. Okay, there are other sins that go outside of committing violence. So the sin is much more of an umbrella term, saying he had committed no sin. So it's making a difference. It's stating something very different if you say it's merely no violence. And then there's an implication in some of those English translations that it's no violence at the time. Okay, when he was being tried, he had committed no violence. So there are all these variations. But if we want to go back to the original intent, we can go back to the Septuagint, which is what we have, the documents. We've got lots of ancient document sources going back to the Septuagint, but we can go back to the Septuagint and see what the sources were thinking at the time. And if we have a question about that, we can look at the New Testament when they reference the Septuagint, and we can look at the way that they expressed words. So you can see right here, he had committed no sin. Okay, and the Jewish thing, the Jewish translation, Chabad says, and he gave his grave to the wicked and the wealthy with his kinds of death because he committed no violence. And there was no deceit in his mouth. Okay, so he committed no violence. It's not saying no sin. Now, here's another one that I found that's interesting. So Isaiah 53:11, the Masoretic says, from the toil of his soul, he would see, he would be satisfied. Okay, so Isaiah 53:11. Now, in the Septuagint, it says he sees light and is satisfied. You can see that that is a reference to something that occurred after the suffering servant had been crucified, right? He was pierced for our transgressions. That appears in Isaiah 53:5, just before that. Now, in the Septuagint, it says he sees light. Now, there's a direct implication or an allusion to the resurrection. Fortunately, we can also see what the Dead Sea Scrolls says, because the Dead Sea Scrolls have quite a few Isaiah copies. Okay, and so here are some that are translated. If you can see this on the right, you can see the Isaiah scrolls. One of them basically says, he will see light and be satisfied. That is in one scroll. Another scroll says, he will see light, he will be satisfied. Another one says, he will see light and be satisfied. Okay, so we've got this idea in the Dead Sea Scrolls that he is going to see the light. You can also see in a different one, G, it says, to show him light. Okay, so this is also, as pointed out by the author of this particular text, which I found online, you can see that he says the light, you can compare that with Isaiah 9:2. Now, I'm just realizing you can't see the reference here, and I feel bad for that author, so I want to make sure you know this is at evangelical textual criticism.blogspot.com. So you can go there and read this author and this person's work on the Dead Sea Scrolls. I actually went back and looked at these Dead Sea Scrolls as far as I could find them online, and I found a lot of pretty interesting things. And so a lot of translations, numerous English translations, exclude the light from Isaiah 53:11. Okay, so this is why I think it's so important to go back and look at what the original says. So the ISV says, out of the suffering of his soul, he will see light and find satisfaction. Okay, so the ISV has, he will see light. The ESV, the KJV, and the NASV do not. Look at this. So like, for example, in the ESV, and I tend to favor that, but it just says, out of the anguish of his soul, he shall see and be satisfied. Okay, where's the light? The light's in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the light's in the Septuagint. Why is it missing from this? Now, fortunately, the NIV, which I think is, in some spots, I'm not a big fan of the NIV. Like, I think that a few of its translations are less than perfect, less than ideal. But here they got it right. After he has suffered, he will see the light of life. So not just even seeing the light, he's seeing the light of life and be satisfied. Okay, so that's going back. Now, this is two of the worst English translations, the NABRE. I shouldn't even draw your attention to it because it's so rotten. But in this particular case, the NABRE got things correctly. They said, he shall see the light. And the NRSV, surprisingly enough, says something correct. He shall see the light. So those two did do well on this particular verse. Now, the NABRE, I'm just going to tell you why I think it's such a rotten translation, is because it appears that some of the authors, some of the people who are authoring that text have an axe to grind, because if you go back and you look at all of the footnotes, especially things like they say Daniel 7 was written in the 2nd century BC, which is pretty much have been debunked by people who take a look at what Daniel actually said. And of course, Jewish people who are Orthodox and believe in their texts that they're divinely ordained, that there's nobody like Daniel is going to be duping them in the 2nd century BC. It also claims there's multiple authors of Isaiah. It also says that in the footnotes. I looked at the footnotes in Daniel on this one, and they were just downright, they were ridiculous. They just didn't even align with what we could find in the text. So it was, and I have other videos on Daniel if you guys want to watch that. Okay, so, whoops, where are we? Okay, so here we go. So in conclusion, when we have ancient translations in text, they're more likely to be true to the original intent of the author than later texts. Okay, Masoretic texts intentionally downplayed prophecies of Jesus in Psalm 22:16, Isaiah 7:14, and references to a second Lord in power and superior to David in Psalm 110, that it stumped the Pharisees. We should rely on English translations if we're looking at English translations. Not all of us speak Koine Greek and speak other languages, ancient Hebrew and Aramaic. So if we're looking at English translations, we should look at the ones that try to find out what the original authors intended. So we can look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Septuagint, the New Testament equivalencies, the New Testament quotations of the Septuagint, and the Masoretic text. We should actually look at the Masoretic text because sometimes they're right on the money. It just tends to be a lot of times with the prophetic stuff in the Old Testament that some things have been changed. So we should look from a variety of translations and try to find the best original intent. Now, I, again, think the flunk out is the NRSV. Of course, I also mentioned the NABRE, which is probably even worse. I just discovered that one today. I discovered it thanks to Mike Winger's video. And so I thought that one was truly awful. And so I'm going to come back to you guys. I wanted to show you another thing. So I want to say hi also to people in the chat, my old friend Slam RN, Patrick Alexander. So we've got Zhang Fukusheng. We actually might have more. Kip Davis. We probably have more. Yeah, no, I don't speak those languages, Kip Davis. And fortunately for me, what I can do is I can find other people who are experts on that, such as Dr. Michael Brown, and look at what he has to say on some of these things. And so that's one of the solutions I have to my lack of knowing the language myself. I just go to the experts and find out, what do they say? Dr. Michael Brown's got a very good take on that. And he also has a very good take, if you're interested, on Psalm 110. So let's see what he says right here.
Psalm 110, quoted more than any other passage of Scripture in the New Testament. The Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. Now, here's the first problem. It's quoted in the New Testament. And the New Testament, as we have it, is written in Greek. So in Greek, it's kurios says to my kurios. The kurios, the Lord says to my kurios. The Lord, same word, kurios, kurios. And some have said, well, see, that indicates that Jesus is equal to the Lord, or he's saying he's Yahweh. No, he's actually not saying that there. That's actually not the argument there. The Hebrew is Yahweh said to my Lord, Adoni. Yahweh said to my Lord. And then it goes on from there. Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. Now, when this was translated into Greek, roughly a couple hundred years before the time of Yeshua, Yahweh was rendered as kurios. There are some ancient Septuagint traditions where they actually may have written out the Hebrew for Yahweh. There's just, you wouldn't actually say it because it was considered too sacred. But otherwise, it's kurios says to my kurios. So the Lord says to my Lord. So when this comes in the New Testament, it's not changing anything. It's just quoting the way it would have been in Greek. But we understand this is Yahweh speaking to my Lord. Who is that? So who's the author of this? If David wrote it, and David says, Yahweh says to my Lord, to my master, to some superior of mine, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. If the Messiah is just David's son and offspring, how can he be greater than David unless in some way he is superior to him so that David calls him my master? That's a question that Yeshua raises to the religious leaders of his day. Whose son is the Messiah? David's son. David's son. Well, then how does David call him Lord? Not Lord meaning Yahweh, but Lord meaning master. Master. Now, there's an objection that has been raised by not a counter-missionary, but a Gentile minister who denies the divine nature of the Messiah. And he says Adoni, whenever Adoni is found, Yahweh says to my Adon, that Adoni is always speaking of someone human. Well, first, there's nothing in the word Adon that says it has to be human. For example, Malachi 3, Ha-Adon, the Lord coming to his temple, speaks of Yahweh. And Ha-Adon, the Lord, always speaks of God himself when it's used like that. But Adon can mean Lord, capital L, Lord, small l, master, capital M, master, small m, in itself. If you wanted to specifically speak of Adonai, the Lord, without the in front of it, speak of this as synonymous with Yahweh, it would be Adonai with kamatz at the end. The final vowel, kamatz, that's like this, for those that are not familiar with it so much in Hebrew, by name as by sight. That would be a choice made by the Masoretes in terms of how they represented that sound. And if it said, Yahweh said to Adonai, that would be Yahweh said to Yahweh. So that's not what he's saying. So he's saying the Lord, Yahweh says to my Lord. Who? Is it speaking about an earthly master? Is it speaking about divine? Is it speaking about the Messiah being, okay, who is it speaking about? Yahweh says to my Lord. If David wrote it, he's saying, Yahweh says this to my superior, to my Lord, to my master. Which Yeshua says, hey, that proves the Messiah is greater than David. He is the son of David. Of course. Doesn't it say that in Matthew, the first chapter, son of David, son of Abraham? First verse of Matthew. Yes, he's the son of David. Of course he's the son of David. Paul speaks of him plainly as the son of David in Romans, the first chapter. But he's also greater than David. Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. Yahweh sends forth from Zion your mighty scepter, rule in the midst of your enemies. Your people will offer themselves freely on the day of your power. In holy garments from the womb of the morning, the dew of your youth will be yours. The Lord has sworn, will not change his mind. You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. The Lord is at your right hand. He will shatter kings on the day of his wrath. He will execute judgment among the nations, filling them with corpses. He will shatter chiefs over the wide earth. He will drink from the brook by the way. Therefore, he will lift up his head. Now, three possible ways to read this. There is a Jewish tradition. We just assume it's homiletical, midrashic, but some rabbis take this as literal and serious. That this was written by Eliezer, the servant of Abraham. Yahweh says to my Lord, my master, Abraham, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. Well, if you want to get technical, the first problem with that is that in the rabbinic tradition, the Messiah sits at God's right hand, and Abraham at best would be sitting at God's left hand. So that creates a problem. Then, as some medieval commentaries pointed out, the Lord sends forth from Zion your mighty scepter. Abraham has no connection to Zion. So aside from being far-fetched, it doesn't even work based on these opening verses. So that leaves us basically with two primary ways of reading it. Either David wrote it about the Messiah, his Lord, his master, his superior, not just his descendant, but someone greater than, or a court poet wrote it for David. Yahweh said about my master David, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. Or be a little forced, David wrote it for a court poet to recite over him, but that would be stretched. So we have those two possibilities. Let's just say a court poet wrote it for David. All right? Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. Did this actually happen? Was David raised up to sit at God's right hand? Resurrection, clear life beyond the grave. To sit at God's right hand until all of his enemies were made a footstool. No, he dies and now Solomon reigns and it goes on. That's the story. So this doesn't happen. Did it happen in his lifetime? No. This is not fulfilled in his lifetime. Oh, he did war and he was great and powerful, but no, this wasn't fulfilled in his lifetime. Also, what about the Lord has sworn will not change his mind, you're a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek? Here's a direct prophecy of his priestly role. So even if it was speaking of David, it now makes David as the messianic figure, the messianic prototype. It makes him a priestly king. So these things were not fulfilled with David. So even if they were spoken by a court poet about David, they tell us the Messiah will be a priestly king, and they tell us that the Messiah will sit at the right hand of God. Why? Because the Messiah will fulfill David's mission. The Messiah is a greater David. That's why a passage like Ezekiel 34 just says David will rule among them. David, the greater David, the messianic David. So, if we say it's about David, we recognize it doesn't reach its fulfillment in David. Therefore, it must reach its fulfillment in the Messiah.
See, just basic stuff, good stuff from Dr. Michael Brown. I hope you guys enjoyed that. I see the and Kip Davis. I can see that you disagree with Dr. Michael Brown, but I happen to agree with him. I think he's been around since the 1970s, studying a lot of this material. He's gone very deeply into the ancient Hebrew. He's gone into the Masoretic texts. He's gone into the ancient Septuagint and all kinds of other stuff. He does know the languages, and he is an expert on this. And so I think he's a pretty good person to rely on for information concerning Psalm 110. And I had another video to show that also had him with James White, because they just recently discussed it. And so Dr. Michael Brown and James White have articulated quite a bit on Psalm 22. And he again distinguishes a ka'aru versus ka'ari, and he looks at what the people believed. And so I just want to say thank you. And so his stuff is pretty good, but he isn't full-time research. Well, actually, he does do research. That's what Michael Brown has been doing since the 1970s. I can say he's done far more research than anyone has had the time to do in a short period, especially if you're a relatively young person. He's been around, as I said, he converted to Christianity sometimes in the 1970s. And so Dr. Michael Brown is a good person to look at. I'm not familiar with what specific degree James White has, but I know he's a Dr. James White. He says it's not a respectable PhD. I don't know what that is. I don't know what Dr. James White has as far as which type of degree or where it came from. And that I suspect is what Kip Davis is talking about. And so I also want to say hi to Nathan, who's in the chat, and Susan, and whoever else is left in here. So those survivors, I say thank you so much, Vera Cruz and Patrick Alexander and Susan and JB and Blaster Master. I saw him come into the chat. Diagoras of Melos. Kip Davis has been in here a few times. Kip is just basically trying to go against everything I said. And of course, I expect that. So we can expect that people will disagree. But I think that the information itself is quite compelling. Very compelling prophecies in the Old Testament. You look at Psalm 22. Even if it's like a lion, my hands and feet. Now, that doesn't even make sense. Like a lion, my hands and feet. There's no verb there. but even if it were that, why is it the specific reference to my hands and feet? What is it about hands and feet? Well, in a crucifixion, your hands and your feet are pierced. So it's pretty interesting stuff. And so I hope I have helped you to edify your faith. I hope you guys have enjoyed today's conversation. I don't see questions. I basically see statements from people. So it looks like we're towards the end. So thank you so much for coming in. I'm going to have David McGuire here tomorrow. He's a pastor, and David came to Jesus through miracles. So a number of miracles occurred in his life. For example, he used to have something that was like post-traumatic stress syndrome. He had a lot of different effects from serving in the military, and I believe it all just went away. And so that's something that's pretty interesting. So thank you for coming in here. Please like, subscribe, and do come again. I'm trying to think of what else I have in the future. I believe I'm also going to try to get back there with the person I had on my channel a couple of days ago. So we're going to try to do some more of those. And so thank you so much. Do you want to talk about this, Kip? I've pretty much talked about it, Kip. I mean, if you want to, I think this channel for this purpose, this one's closed. But I mean, if you want to have a future conversation, we can set something up. If you want to chat about this, I'm fine to do that. And Slam, yeah, you know David McGuire well. That's wonderful. And so, yeah, I'm trying to make sense. So thank you so much. Well, it actually, Digital Gnosis, it says, which makes sense, verb or noun? Well, it has both. He was pierced. That's that one. So his hands and feet were pierced. Okay. So anyway, okay. So thank you so much, everybody. Please like, subscribe, and do come again. And just remember, whether you eat, drink, or whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God. Thank you so much.